Hello, I'm Leighton Hamlin.
And I'm Darlene Gonzalez.
And we're the Public Policy Advocacy team for Crandall, Texas.
We are here to empower families of victims for them to find closure.
And to also protect those who have been wrongly convicted of murder and to protect them from the unjust complications that come with the broken execution system that we have now. So here is our project identification card, and then our table of contents that you can refer back to for any information that you might need. And here is also our evidence of online submission.
Our FCCLA planning process involves that the United States has a high proportion of convictions, which means that during the past few years they have come to light and have produced exonerations that are concentrated in cases in which defendants are being sentenced wrongfully. At least 4.1% have been executed and they were found innocent afterwards. And 20.1% of victims have been found to not have wished this execution to even have taken place. So we feel that families of victims are not being given the voice to express their wishes in accordance to these certain convictions. Our goal is to join this advocacy group known as Murder Victims Families for Human Rights and work with them to gain this sort of resolution to an issue that not only helps push towards the abolishment of federal death penalty, but also empower the families of these victims. This is our form of plan. You can refer back to it, but we are going to be going through it in depth throughout the presentation. Our act is to reach out to these specific organizations and come across with a new petition or an updated petition in order to get this goal to come across. The follow-up is just going to be seeing how many signatures we get on these petitions.
So our issue type. Our issue is the right of life. So murder victims have, and the families of human rights and death penalty action. So united by the belief that capital punishment violates all legal and ethical rights, standards, and through extensive speaking and organized experience, they can get families the empowerment they need and the closure that they need by mobilizing a generation of people to abolish the federal death penalty to bring closure. So our research. So the 2019 successful repeal of New Hampshire's death penalty was led by State Representative Rennie Cushing, who is the leader of the organization we were working with. And his father and brother-in-law were both murdered in two separate incidents years apart. And before Connecticut repealed the death penalty, 179 murder victims' families signed a letter to legislators advocating the abolition of the death penalty. It is not what families want. They do not want the people who are convicted with the murder of their family members to be killed. They want closure without the death of another human being. So in any close examination of federal death penalty cases, you'll find trauma, mental illness, and procedural disasters, and a mix of junk science and a lack of evidence that leads to problematic convictions. And the federal death penalty is plagued by the same problems that have caused people to move away from the death penalty in other states. So what is the death penalty? The death penalty is the capital punishment for any high crime or misdemeanor such as murder or treason, and it is the state-sanctioned homicide of a person as a punishment for a crime. And anybody who is sentenced to a death sentence will eventually undergo the death penalty. So the types of death penalties. There are many types of death penalties, such as through firing squad, hanging, electrocution, gas chambers, and today the most prevalent, which is lethal injection. So all these forms of execution are without their complications. And since 1890, all of these executions had roughly 3.15% complication rate. And the highest complication being the most prevalent form today, which is the lethal injection, which has 7.12% complication rate, which wrongly affect those who are set for execution. So the death penalty rates. Since 1976, 1,532 individuals have been executed in the United States, with 1/3 of these executions occurring in our home state, Texas. 1,352 individuals have been killed by lethal injection, 163 by electrocution, 11 by gas chamber, and 3 by hanging, and 3 by firing squad. All of these forms of execution are unjust, and they cause undue complications that further harm the families who are looking for closure and cause undue suffering to those who have been convicted. So who's given the death penalty and why? So in the present state, those convicted of the death sentence are majority charged with murder and that are considered overwhelmingly heinous. So although the capital punishment is reserved for heinous crimes, To date, 174 of these sent to death have been proven innocent before their wrongful executions. So bringing into the question, how many Americans have been wrongly stripped of their right to life due to prejudice or false accusations? And then according to our chart over here, not in accordance with the percentage of the population in the U.S., blacks make up 34.1% of those executed. And the race of victims that were, the race of the victims in the death penalty cases were majority white. So it's all about the prejudice of black individuals that are wrongfully accused of killing white individuals without the proper evidence. So the history of the death penalty. So the death penalty has a long history in the United States, and it started with the first execution in 1608, and it was heavily influenced by the public executions in Britain. So in early America, crimes were punishable by death were plentiful. They could be because of theft, killing of others' livestock, or just not believing in the true God. So, and as the death penalty use increased from the 17th to the 19th century, the death penalty was eventually limited to certain major crimes such as murder and treason. But although they were limited, the amount of executions continued to rise, and as the requirements tightened. And then at the peak of the executions in the early 20th century, then there was a moratorium in 1976, but since then there's been a resumption of executions with the same issues from before.
Here we have a diagram where we can see that as the years of conviction go by, there's a less probability of being executed. But even then we see cases, especially that of Daniel Lewis Lee, in which even though he had been in jail for 30 years, he was still executed. Our project goals are specifically to reach out to this advocacy group known as Murder Victims Family for Human Rights and partnering organization known as the Death Penalty Action, and work with them to suggest sort of a certain amount of information to include in the regards of families of victims and their take on the appropriateness of the death penalty in their specific cases, as well as their inabilities to find closure after these executions, proving that it wasn't worth taking a life. We're going to be working with both organizations to gain this sort of attention to the issue and not only help push towards the abolishment of federal death penalty, but also empower the families of these victims. Our elevator speech is about the Daniel Lee case. On July 7th, the execution of Daniel Lee Lewis came over days of legal wrangling and delays. His final words were, "You're killing an innocent man." Critics argued that the government was creating an unnecessary and manufactured urgency simply for political gain of the Trump administration. One of the Lee's lawyers, Ruth Friedman, said that it was shameful that the government saw it fit to carry out this execution during a pandemic. And Attorney General William Barr stated that they had to carry it out because the death penalty was necessary in order for the families to find closure. But this wasn't true because we saw earlier that 20.1% of these people did not find closure with the death of another person. The issue here is that with this statement, there was an objection by the victims' relatives in carrying out the conviction and after nearly 3 decades of the person being imprisoned. Because of this action, we believe that it's not only right to abolish the federal death penalty, but also to provide these families with a voice in the court. To accomplish this goal, we have reached out to the organizations that we have mentioned before and their representatives to include this information in their petition backgrounds. We are targeting the general public as well as these organized directors and the families of victims. We could not volunteer to talk to the families because of the pandemic, but we were able to post information on social media platforms and email these representatives. Our profile partnerships are that of the DPA, which simply act as a support and resource platform for these organizations and are the ones who wrote the original petition. And then the Murder Victims Families for Human Rights is an international non-governmental organization of the murder victims and family members of the executed, all whom oppose the death penalty in their research cases. Our method of action was to email the director, Rennie Cushing, which is also a New Hampshire representative, and this was our email, and after about a week of emailing him, he included this information in their petition. Our media involvement basically involved retweeting and posting things directing to these specific stories and to also direct them to the petition board so that people could sign. Our standards were that we summarized local and global policy issues and trends in the workplace and community and family dynamics that affect the individuals and families, as well as encouraged democracy and provided opportunities for decision making. This was our results. After a week of including this information, we saw that there was an increase in about 1,000 more signatures, and we're very close. This was as of January 1st, 2021, and this will also help influence getting reform to give victims, or the families of victims, a stronger voice. And that is it. Thank you for listening, and please consider our FCCLA advocacy.
Thank you.